Hi everybody, this is Wemmje, and welcome to my Love VFX course, in which I will talk about the creation of my fantasy short film nöck with Nuke Studio. You can find the link to my short film in the description of this video. In this lesson I will focus on the creation of sh230 and 240.
Okay, so here we are back in Nuke Studio. In sh230 we can see another point of view of the young girl, right when she's arriving at the shoreline deck with the creature, where the creature will try to pull the girl into the water with him in some of the following shots. Let's take a closer look at the Nuke script. If you have watched the other compositing related lessons of this course, you should already be familiar with the structure of my comps by now. I will only talk about some particular areas of this comp, and I will not talk about the beauty rebuild setup of the creature, since I have done that in the previous lesson. In this script I want to focus on the creation of the CG version of the shoreline deck, and how I converted the creature's deep data into a depth pass for the ZV focus node. I had to create a CG version of the shoreline deck in comp because my LED on set was not high and strong enough to illuminate the whole shoreline deck at once. The simple fix for that problem was a combination of two plates with a 3D projection setup in Nuke. In the first plate that I shot, I illuminated the long part of the shoreline deck. In the second plate, which was the main plate with the camera movement, I illuminated the short part of the shoreline deck. This projection setup is based on the same workflow that I have talked about in lesson 7 of this course. The tricky part about this shot was that I had to create two camera projections with two different frames that I projected at two different points in the timeline to create the illuminated texture for the two parts of the shoreline deck. I used the card and an edit geo node as the geometry for this projection setup, and I used stamps to create 3 instances of this geo, with the help of 3 apply material nodes for the 3 areas where I needed to place the geometry. In the first projection setup, I projected frame 1001 of the undistorted and denoised plate on the geo, which was for the short part of the shoreline deck. In the second projection setup, I projected frame 1049 of the undistorted and denoised plate on the geo, which was for the long part of the shoreline deck. But before projecting this frame onto the geo in the second setup, I took the illuminated plate of the long part of the shoreline deck, color corrected it, transformed it, and merged frame 1049 of it over frame 1049 of the denoised plate with the help of a roto node. After I moved both of these projections into the UV space, with the scanline render's projection mode set to UV, I extracted certain parts of the shoreline deck to duplicate them and created brighter and cleaner versions of the two parts of the shoreline deck. To match the duplicated parts and make them fit to the rest of the image, I used crop, corner pin, and transform nodes. Then I merged the two parts together and used them as a texture for the shoreline deck geo. After rendering this texture geo with another scanline render node that is set to render camera in its projection mode and has an overscan value of 100 pixels, I used a remove node to keep the RGBA channels. To create a depth pass that I could use for the whole plate, I created another 3D setup with a huge version of the shoreline deck geo, so that it would cover the whole frame. Then I used the copy node to copy the depth pass into the B pipe that comes out of the scanline render, and pre-rendered this whole setup with the right node that is set to all, so that the depth pass would also be rendered. After bringing this pre-render back from the footage backdrop with stamps, I added an edge blur to it. Since the 3D camera of this setup is based on an undistorted version of the plate, I undistorted the plate before the 3D projection setup, and at the end I distorted this rendering with this ST-map setup to match it to the lens distortion of the denoised plate. If you want to know more about the lens distortion setup that I have used here, you can check out lesson 5 of this course. While merging the CG shoreline deck over the plates, I also merged the depth channel with the B pipe by setting the Also Merge drop-down menu of the merge node to depth. That way I could use the depth channel in this CD focus node to defocus the comp. Normally, you would not want to ZD focus your background and foreground separately, like I did in this comp. Ideally, you would want to make sure that both of your elements are sharing the same 3D space, so you could also merge the depth channels together and just use one ZD focus node. The reason why I did not do that in this case is because the CG shoreline deck and the CG creature do not share the same 3D space. The last thing I wanted to show you in this shot is how I used the deep pass of the creature to generate a depth pass and use it in the ZD focus node for the creature. The reason why I chose to do it that way is because I believe that the deep data can be more accurate than the depth channel at the edges of your rendered elements, especially when you're dealing with hair on your CG characters. And if you use the deep data for your depth channel, you also don't need to set up your depth pass in your 3D application for your shots. Of course, you have to consider that the DPXR file sizes are a lot bigger than the regular EXR files, and many companies actually render out the deep data as a separate pass. In the end, and as with many things in life, I think it comes down to what you personally need for your comps whenever you are working on your own projects. Alright, here is what I did to use the deep data from V-Ray as the depth pass, to use it in the ZD focus node for the creature. First of all, I used the shuffle node to shuffle the creature's front deep data into the RGB channels. I could have also just shuffled out the red channel, because that channel will be used as the depth channel later on. But I like to use the RGB channels so I can keep looking at the RGB channels in the viewer the whole time. But that is just a personal preference. After shuffling out the deep data into the RGB channels, I used an expression node to normalize the data and bring it from a range of numbers that go way above 1 to a 0 to 1 range. In this range, you get a value that is closer to 1 the closer your CG element gets to the camera, and you get a value that is closer to 0 the further your CG element moves away from the camera. To achieve this normalization of the deep data with an expression node, you just need to type 1/R in the fields for the red, green, and blue channel. This awesome trick was shown to me by the one and only Tony Lyons. So thank you, Tony, for helping me out with this awesome workflow, which I will definitely use for my projects in the future. After the expression node, I pre-multiplied the RGB with the original alpha, and then I created an anchor with stamps from Nukepedia to get an instance of this output that I can generate from any location of my node tree. If you have not heard about stamps, you should check out lesson 6 of this course. In lesson 8 of this course, I have talked about how I only keep the RGB channels in my beauty rebuild setups with a remove node that is set to keep RGB to improve the performance of my script. That is why I need to get the depth channel into the B pipe at this point of the comp, right before using the ZD focus node. In some of my scripts, I like to copy the depth channel into the B pipe, along with the copy node that I used to copy the original alpha into the B pipe, like I have shown you in lesson 8 of this course. In some other situations, like in this one, I like to use a separate copy node to copy the depth channel into the B pipe. Another step you can take to improve the quality of the edges of your depth pass is to extend the depth channel's pixels. In this setup, I did that by getting my normalized depth from the deep data, blurring it with a blur node that is set to RGBA and 1 in the size knob, and unpremulting that slightly blurred output with an unpremult node. After that, I used the merge node to merge the extended depth under the regular normalized depth. And then I used the shuffle node to shuffle the red channel of this output into the depth channel. And finally, I used the copy node to copy the new depth channel into the B pipe, so I could use it in the ZD focus node. Using the deep data for the depth channel and extending the depth channel's pixels to improve the quality of the edges of the depth pass worked really great for this project. I'm usually a fan of using deep data for rendering depth of field, with a tool that is called PG Bokeh from a company that is called Peregrine Labs. But this time I wanted to try out something else, which really worked like a charm. And that was it for this shot. Let's take another look at it. This is the transformed plate. This is the comp. And this is the graded comp. Now let's take a look at shot 240. In this shot we can see the girl arriving at the shoreline deck, but we cannot see the creature here, because only the girl and her mother can see it. That is why you can only see the creature during the short film, in the shots where you can see the point of view of the girl and the point of view of the mother in the last shot. The basic structure of this Nuke script is very simple. On the right side you can see the background, which consists of a sky by night with a full moon, some stars and some clouds, And on the left side, you can see the extracted foreground plate with the girl arriving at the shoreline deck. Of course, I got rid of the sky in this plate because it's being replaced with the new sky, as you can see here. Now let me walk you through the script. In the footage backdrop on the left side, we have the plate, the denoise plate, the grain plate that I used to regrain all of the comps with Das Grain, and the noise plate that I used to reduce the fixed noise pattern in the plate. You can find out more about how I removed this fixed noise pattern in lesson 5, and some more about how I used this grain plate with my regraining setup and the help of Das Grain in lesson 6 of this course. On the right side of the footage backdrop, you can see an 8K texture of the moon that I used for a 3D setup and a pre-rendered frame of that setup. This 8K texture of the moon is available for free at solarsystemscope.com/textures. You can find this link in the description of this video. And just like in every comp, I used stamps to create instances of the footage all over the script. If you want to find out more about stamps, you should check out lesson 6 of this course. Now let's continue with the sky. I created the majority in the sky backdrop with a few constants, a masked key mix node, and some masked color corrections to get an overall color for the sky and a big bright spot that serves as the background color for the glowing moon. In the stars backdrop, I used a roto paint node to paint some stars on the background, a color correction, a filter erode, and a glint node to make them look a bit more like tiny and shining stars. And then I just added the stars to the background with a merge node that is set to plus. In the moon backdrop, I connected the 8K moon texture to a sphere and used the simple 3D setup to get a pre-rendered frame of the moon. Then I color corrected it, transformed it, and created 2 brighter versions of the moon that I merged over the background. One version with a big glow, and another version that is very bright and slightly defocused. In the clouds backdrop, I created a mask with some masked noise nodes that I used to color correct the background. And by the way, I created a tutorial about clouds with Houdini, V-Ray, and Nuke a few months ago that you can also take a look at if you want, because I reused quite a few Nuke setups from that tutorial in this shot. I'll leave a link to that tutorial in the description of this video. After adding the clouds to the background, I defocused the whole image a bit, merged the foreground plate over the sky, graded the comp by increasing the lift a tiny bit, added a digital zoom with a transform and a crop node to the comp, and then I regrained the comp with this Das Grain setup. And again, you can check out lesson 6 to find out a bit more about this setup. There were only a few things that I did to modify the foreground plate. I retouched it a bit, especially to get rid of the lower part of the C-stand, color corrected it to make it fit to the brightness and the colors of the new sky, removed the sky of the foreground plate, and then I transformed the whole foreground plate to make room for the new sky, right before merging it over the background. And that was it for this shot. Let's take another look at it. This is the transformed plate. This is the comp. And this is the graded comp. I'm really happy about how the graded comp looks, and I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial.
That was it for this lesson. In the next lesson, which will be the final lesson of this course, I will talk about the creation of shot 280 and 330 of my short film nöck. Feel free to post any questions you have about my work in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer all of your questions. If you want to see more of these videos, don't forget to subscribe. Again, this is Lars Wemmje. Thank you for watching, and goodbye everybody.